is God actually present? Events like the Holocaust, 9/11. Where was God in that?
Jupiter and Zeus, Marduk and Baal are all the same character, just with slightly altered names.
When you understand it out of context, it's wild. But then you put it in context, and that makes so much sense.
There's not a person alive on the planet who does not have moments where they look back and say, where was God in this?
What are some of the gods, in your opinion, that still exist today that maybe we don't acknowledge? Because
Hello. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. My name is Cassie Bellino, and I'm your host. In this podcast, we talk about the Bible in simple terms with experts, PhDs, and scholarly theologians to make understanding God easier. These conversations have transformed my relationship with Christ and understanding of religion. Now, I'm sharing these recorded conversations with you. On this podcast, we talk about the facts, the history, and the translations to make the Bible make sense, so we can get to know God, our Creator, better.
Hi, it's Cass. I wanted to first start off by saying thank you for listening. I created this because I could not find it anywhere else on the internet, and it takes a very small team and a large upfront investment to make it all possible. I really hope that you find it valuable. I would never expect anything from my listeners, and I'm always going to do my best to first outsource support from brands. However, if you do find value in this episode, I invite you to contribute an amount equal to the value that you have received, either through a one-time or a monthly donation linked in the show notes below. I understand that not everyone, though, can donate monetarily. So I ask that if you love Biblically Speaking and you cannot donate, please show your support by subscribing to this channel wherever you're listening so that it tells the hosting platform to show Biblically Speaking to more curious and confused Christians. In exchange for the support, I personally promise to you to always create the highest quality production possible. Thank you so much for listening. Now let's get to the show.
Hello. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. I'm your host, Cassie Bellino. This conversation is going to be all over the place, but I guarantee you that these are some of the questions that you've probably asked yourself as a curious and confused Christian, such as looking at world history and wondering, are these events random or is God actually present? And I mean like the real events, like the Holocaust, 9/11. Where was God in that? Was that part of the plan? Was that the enemy at work? And it feels like, we're kind of in Exodus, but what if those events are carrying a deeper spiritual confrontation and we're just completely missing this? So today we're going to go into a few big questions, like multiple gods and the source of paganism. And where did that really come from? Like, what if the stories of Zeus and Jupiter, they're not myths, but they're echoes of something that actually existed and still exists? Something that began, and this is something we've talked about on the show, the Tower of Babel. So we're going to go back into this with a new perspective because I've got a fresh new guest today. Today, my guest is Dr. George Grant. You are many things. You are the pastor Parish of Presbyterian Church, PCA. You're the founder of Franklin Classical School, of the Chalmers Fund, and the King's Meadow Study Center. You're the author of multiple 6 books, just a few. And your teaching career has taken you from the D. James Kennedy at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church to lecturing now at Knox Theological Seminary. And you were featured in Is Genesis History, which this is a dream for me to be interviewing you, because when I saw that documentary, that was at the very beginning of this podcast of like, yes, people that are talking about faith in a very modern way that makes it relevant, not so far distant like this ancient Bible, but today, and talking about it with archaeological facts and fossils. We've had multiple amazing guests on the show. So it's such an honor to have you on the show, Dr. Grant. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, and it is a delight. I love your show, and I'm grateful for the work that you have done, the wide variety of things that you have covered. And this is a delight.
Thank you. Yeah, the Bible's not bland. It really reaches every aspect of reality.
You're right. You're right.
I know. I'm so blessed that God let me do this and, gave the idea and like, let me do this because it to me, it's like job security. It's like, this will never run out of topics. And we've already discussed Tower of Babel and the source of multi-gods. We talked about Dr. James Sedlacek and Dr. Joseph Miller. And to have you here, it's going to be slightly different because I think recognizing God's hand within these events and recognizing other gods within that. I think we were talking about this before the show of like, God still exists today. And we're just so modernized that the Bible and gods and paganism seems like something of the past. It seems like, almost like lore or, like medieval, like stories, but it's like very much so present today. So I'm really excited for you to kind of bring that to the forefront and really explain it in a way that's easy to understand, because in my head, I know it's there, but I can't really put my finger on it. And maybe some people aren't even aware that it's there. Hopefully this conversation brings us closer. But one of the things that I want to start with in this conversation is, how did you even get here? Like, how did you come to know about paganism, cults, multiple gods? Like, where did your interests in life, how'd they lead you here?
Well, I've been a Christian for more than 60 years. And so I've had a lot of cultural experiences along the way in my Christian life that have shaped my interests and my passions. I love history. I've taught history, studied history, written books of history. And so the historical perspective and the application to present day cultural events has always sort of been at the forefront. But early on in my Christian life, I was involved with ministries to cults, and particularly Eastern cults. When I was in college, I was fascinated by the Middle East, and I went to the University of Houston, which has a tremendous amount of emphasis on the petroleum production world, which in the 70s was so centrally located in the Middle East. And so I became fascinated with Islam and Zoroastrianism and all of those kinds of things. And then just as a student of the Bible, simply finding a way to get all of those things connected to what we see in the scriptures in a way that made sense. So all of those things sort of worked together to pique my interest and to sort of prod my professional career along.
That's amazing. I think history is like the coolest part about the Bible. Like, I think that like it happened and the way that it played in with other global events, it's just the most interesting thing to me, because I think when we understand the history, we understand the context. And with that, we understand the meanings behind why certain things are said and why they're said, because we're just not privy to the conversations or the cultural happenings that were happening at that time. We take it out of context and it doesn't make any sense to us.
Right.
And then you put it in context and you're like, oh yeah, if I was there, I would have done the same thing.
Yeah. Well, 3/4 of the Bible is history. And part of the way that the redemption story plays out is it plays out in space, in time, in history, with real people, with real stories and real drama across the backdrop of multiple cultures, so that you get to see God's hand across the whole spectrum of human experience and human history. So it's really, really important that we understand where we have come from, how we got here, so that we can plot the trajectory to the future. Otherwise, we're just wandering in the dark.
Absolutely. And great segue into the first topic, which is pre-recorded history, what was happening in the world. Because I think as a Christian, we think logically, we like to think that we do. And it starts with Adam and Eve. It starts with the first people. And then it goes up until Jesus in the Gospels. And then, talks about the ending, what's to come, Revelation. As a Christian, it's really hard for me to say, okay, that's the beginning of time. And now we're relating it to today. Obviously the Bible doesn't like end in 2025, obviously, but it is like what happened before the written history. We're kind of looking back in the Bible. Yeah. We're looking back in time. So what was happening before all this was written down? Could you tell me, catch me up, first person to know. I'm just kidding. But how do
Yeah.
we talk about that without it being written down?
Well, the first two chapters of Genesis provide us with God's perfect design for the world. There are 20 creation ordinances in the first two chapters. And those 20 creation ordinances tell us what God intended his perfect world to be and how it's to function. And those 20 ordinances begin with a pre-existent, altogether sovereign God, in the beginning God. And then it starts working its way through everything from the creation of matter, Genesis 1-2, the realization that there is a separation between the creator and his creation. In other words, there is a distinction between matter that God creates and this pre-existent sovereign God who creates that matter ex nihilo, out of nothing. And then it proceeds through everything from the creation of linear history to the swarming of the various kinds of flora and fauna in the world. Those creation ordinances give us a picture of God's perfect plan. That plan is disrupted in Genesis chapter 3 by the fall. Adam and Eve stumble and fall into sin, and that creates havoc in all of creation. At that point, the Bible's story is the unfolding of God's purposeful redemption. So, in a sense, the Bible is not a history book, although it contains a lot of history. What it is, it's a narrative of God's providential works, glimpses of God's providential works across time, revealing his redemptive plan. And his redemptive plan, according to the New Testament and much of the prophetic Old Testament, is to restore every broken thing. This is why in Romans chapter 8, we're told that even creation groans for the day of redemption. And by the time we get to the last chapter in the book of Revelation, we see that this perfect restoration has occurred. In other words, what God is doing in history is he is using his people and his purposeful providence to restore that original design that was disrupted by the fall. So if we want to know what God is going to do, where he is taking history, we have to first look at those 20 creation ordinances so that we can see what God's original plan was for men, for women, for families, for the work in the world, the call to guard and tend the garden. So all of that is set forth in the first two chapters. We have disruption in the third chapter, and then in the fourth chapter of Genesis, all the way through Genesis chapter 11, we have that sort of before much is recorded in history stuff going on. We have Cain and Abel and Lamech, all the way up to Methuselah and leading to the flood of Noah. One thing that's really interesting is that all of those 11 first chapters in Genesis are organized around the Hebrew word toldoth, which means generations. And so it's a very orderly sort of structure for us to understand first the generations of creation and then the generations of man leading all the way up to Abraham. And what's really interesting is that we actually have specific numbers given for the lifespan of generations. And if you add up those numbers, you quickly realize that some of the last characters in those generations actually died in the flood. Methuselah died in the flood.
Wait, what about the numbers indicates that?
So you just add up their ages, and you figure out, subtract Noah's 500 years old when he starts to have his family and gives birth to, his wife gives birth to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if you then look at how old Methuselah was when he gave birth, when Noah was born, you start to realize, oh my goodness, you do the math and you realize, okay, this is a very orderly, well-prepared, well-preserved chronology. Genesis is not a history book, but it is filled with history, and it's accurate history. It all adds up. So
you know so much more than me.
Yeah. So
you're like, it makes so much sense. I'm like, oh my gosh.
I know. And what we know about hydrology and the structure of the geological formations of the earth, we can look and we can see that there is substantial scientific support for the fact that there was a global flood. We know, for instance, just recently, because of the floods in Texas, in Kerrville, they have now uncovered again, just like they have in Glen Rose, Texas, dinosaur footprints in the stone right next to human footprints. So you have dinosaur footprints and human footprints in the same stone, in the same seedbed. And that seabed in Texas is limestone, so it's really easy to see how both a dinosaur's footprint and a human footprint could be in the same piece of same strata of stone. But all of that to say, between the time of Genesis 4 and the time of Abraham in Genesis 12, we have a lot of human history that is not recorded. We have this very thin timeline where we have some evidence. And you have these huge events, the flood and the Tower of Babel, that sort of demarcate that period. So what's going on during that time?
Right.
Well, the Bible gives us a little glimpse of the development of human culture, with Jubal and Tubal-Cain and a host of other characters who begin to fashion iron tools and musical instruments and a host of other things. Linguists have been able to trace the patterns and the pathways of language trajectories. Dr. Joseph Kikasola, for instance, has written a marvelous book in which he has traced backwards all of the human languages as they have traveled across the earth, and has demonstrated that almost beyond any shadow of a doubt, all human languages were once centered in a single place in the Middle East, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Tower of Babel. So we know from linguists that we can trace back to the Tower of Babel, and we can follow the remarkable structures of languages, because while the languages split, there are ghost elements of that original human language that show up in all languages. As they begin to morph and shape, as they distance themselves further and further from the Fertile Crescent. And all languages are polyglot, in a sense.
Oh.
They all have bits and pieces.
It's hard to imagine that English, oh my gosh, English and Chinese have any similarities whatsoever.
But they do. They have, these root stems that are very, very similar. They are vastly different now because of isolation from one another and unique cultural circumstances, unique environmental circumstances. One of the things that we tend to forget that languages are never static. I have a podcast on just grammar and vocabulary and language. And one of the things that I repeatedly say is languages never stay still. They're constantly morphing and changing. And
what?
So you can find etymological roots of words, and they tell remarkable stories. So Dr. Kikasola was able to demonstrate that there is this pathway, this journey that all of these languages have followed. Unfortunately, anthropologists have not been able to do the same thing with the migration of tribes and peoples as accurately.
You'd think that would go hand in hand.
You would. The problem is that there are all of these disruptive events that occur. Everything from earthquakes and volcanic eruptions to shifts in the plate tectonics of continents and all of the rest. But what we're able to do is we are able, through the combination of anthropology and linguistics, sort of trace some of the stories that have emerged in human societies. And this is where we get to the gods and to the myths. In a sense, if the Bible, if we posit that the Bible is true and that there was an actual Tower of Babel event, and that from that event the peoples were scattered across the earth, at one time they had a common set of stories. They had common knowledge of events that had occurred prior. So this is one of the reasons why the story of Noah and his flood shows up over and over and over again in the mythologies of the peoples that scatter. Not just things like the Gilgamesh epic, which you would sort of expect because it's in the same region.
That's like top of mind. But what else? What else has a flood?
Marduk, you start to see parts of the story of Noah show up with Ra in Egypt. Parts of the story wind up in old Icelandic narratives.
I feel like the first thing that people think about with that is like, well, then how do we not know that Ra was the correct one and Christians copied theirs?
Sure. And that's a great question. Which came first? And what we can do is we can trace through both the linguistic pathways and the anthropological pathways. We can trace all of them back to the Fertile Crescent.
Whoa.
So we know that the Fertile Crescent was the seed bed for all of those stories, all of those languages, all of those root words.
I want to take a minute and say thank you to the recording service that has made this podcast possible, Riverside. When I started my podcast, I had literally no idea what I was doing, and I just wanted a single way to record, edit, and share content without wasting time on different platforms. Then a friend suggested Riverside to me, and I'll tell you what, it was literally an answer to prayer. With just one login, I can record my interviews with scholars, clip interview moments into Reels for Instagram and TikTok, and post directly onto my RSS feed and Spotify, all without the extra downloads, platforms, all of it. So for the curious and confused people like me, the best part is that the crew at Riverside actually listens to their users when they need help. I wanted an editing preset to save time on creating reel templates, and they listened. They literally implemented a new feature. And since using Riverside, my social clips have reached over 1 million people each month. And I haven't even unlocked all the features yet. Live streaming is going to be next. So if you're considering starting a podcast or you just need to edit at a pro level for content or interviews,
I cannot recommend Riverside enough. If this is helpful for you, I ask that you click the affiliate link I provided in the show notes description. It costs nothing extra to you, and it gives a small kickback to me, which helps the channel stay alive. Thank you so much. Now back to the show.
So that much we know. Again, the Bible is not a history book, and so it's not giving us a timeline, and it's not giving us a perfect chronology and sequence. It's telling us the story of God's redemptive and providential purposes. And so there are gaps and skips, and obviously there's a whole panoply of other individuals and civilizations that the Bible does not touch on. Its purpose is to give us a glimpse of how those 20 creation ordinances are going to eventually be fully restored in the new heavens and the new earth through God's redemptive plan. But what we do have in the Bible is enough for us to start to realize precisely what Matthew Henry, the great Puritan commentator, said frequently, which is, the devil has no stories. Meaning, all of the myths, they are really just distorted, twisted, inverted, or sometimes plagiarized versions of the one true original story. If we presuppose that the Bible is the very Word of God, and that it is inerrant, that it is perfectly preserved across time by the power of the Holy Spirit, then all of this starts to make a lot of sense. And we're able to see in all of the mythological structures remnants of original stories.
Wow. Okay. So much from languages. That's not at all how I thought this would go, which is I'm so glad you're here, Dr. Grant. But when it comes to, stories that I've heard in the past, or I don't want to say stories, but explanations that I've heard in the past from other scholars have always said, like, Tower of Babel was really just I want to say, like, dissemination of demons. When he sent out, he cast out everybody from the Tower of Babel. They were cast out. They changed languages. He separated people. The angels that ruled over those separated nations of different languages, those angels took worship for themselves. Those are, the fallen men. And that's kind of where it's like, well, we're worshiping a God because it has power. It's supernatural. It's an angel. We just thought it was God, but it was actually an angel. It was this like subpar version. That's where we get Ra. That's where we get Baal. And that's where we get, I can't think of any other, was Asherah, all those other ones. And would you say that that's in the same direction that you're going, aside from linguistic, like, remnants and copycats of the original story of Christ and of creation and of a loving God? What element of supernatural, like demonic activity, do you see in this?
Well, that's something that history doesn't record for us, but we can posit it. So the answer to your question is yes. Yes to all of it. Okay. There are metaphysical forces in the world at work that we don't see, but we can see trace elements of. One of the ways that we see that, one of the ways that we see that is simply when you compare the Greek, the Roman, the Babylonian, and the Canaanite pantheon of gods, you start to realize that Jupiter and Zeus, Marduk and Baal are all the same character, just with slightly altered names. They have the same powers, they have the same authority, and then
do they have the same creation story?
They come from the same story, and again, they're distorted. Over time they morph. They're elaborated. It's like the fisherman's story. It starts out as a fish this big, and then it gets, so you have those exaggerations. Yeah, but Hera, Juno, Ishtar, and Ashtoreth, they're all the same character. It's one story, just told through 4 different lenses. Athena, Minerva, Nabu, and Tabala are all the same character. Hermes, Mercury, Shalat, and Namtara are all the same character. And when you look at Ares, Mars, Ashur, and Isham, they're all doing the same thing. Each one of them is, the god of war. They have a certain appearance and certain powers. So what that means is there is this sort of root, and the root is all men are inclined to idolatry. John Calvin says, every human heart is an idol factory. Idolatry is where we go when we rebel against the one true God. So if it is our natural inclination, if it is our natural inclination to run to anything and everything but the one true God, because it's our fallen nature, because we're all about ourselves, we're all about our pleasure, we're all about self-satisfaction and self-esteem and self-everything, then it's an easy play to have the stories all comport across all cultures. Now, the further we get from the primeval age, the stories tend to elaborate more and more. So by the time we get to the Norse gods or the Celtic gods, they're slightly altered, but they wind up being the same characters.
Okay,
they are the
I
same
feel like
characters.
that is like relatively recent compared to like Exodus level, like Canaanites. It's like,
Right.
like, what is the one of the ocean? God,
Poseidon.
Like
Poseidon.
like that.
Yeah.
That seems more recent than like Baal. Baal.
Well, yes and no. There is, when you look at Baal and you look at some of the ancient Canaanite gods, there was a god of the sea who was a son of Baal, like Poseidon is a son of Zeus. And he had similar powers, and he unleashed, storms upon his enemies, and he acts like a Marvel, superhero, just sort of an enlarged human being. And so you get a lot of comportment and congruency between the stories, even across vast spans of time.
Running my own podcast, I'm always moving too fast. I'm finding guests, I'm editing episodes, I'm creating reels, or guesting on other shows. Not to mention, I just live in a world that moves fast. Notifications, trends, endless to-do lists. You know what feels like a blessing in all that? Slowing down. I'd love nothing more than a moment to pause, be present, and choose something timeless. That's exactly what Dwell Label is all about. When I first discovered Dwell Label, it wasn't just about the clothes, it was about a mindset. Thoughtful, intentional fashion that doesn't scream for attention, but instead invites you to slow down. Their pieces are modern takes on classic styles, made to last, not just for the season, but for years. I love that I can throw on a Dwell Label outfit for editing in a coffee shop, Bible studies, or looking professional in an interview. It always feels right, comfortable, effortless, elevated. And here's the best part. Dwell Label does not just talk about rest. They live it. Their website literally doesn't work on Sundays because they believe in pausing and dwelling on what matters most. So if you're looking for high quality, timeless fashion that aligns with a lifestyle of intention and presence, I can't recommend Dwell Label enough. Shop Dwell Label with the link in the show notes and use my code BIBSPEAK15, BIBSPEAK15 for an exclusive discount at checkout. Take a breath, slow down, and dwell in the good things. Now, back to the show. But you said that they become more, manipulated, more evolved?
Yeah,
more
exaggerated.
elaborate?
Yeah, if you've ever watched, for instance, a cartoonist who creates characters. If you look at the original Mickey Mouse, the original Mickey Mouse was very rodent-like. Walt Disney created this character, and over time, it becomes more and more cartoonish. Well, the same thing happens with our stories. They are a little bit more realistic at the beginning, and then they start to become more and more cartoonish over time. And so that's one of the things that happens with the stories. So by the time we get to Thor or Odin, you have a much more Viking-like, pantheon of gods, as opposed to the gods of Mount Olympus or the gods of Ur from the Mesopotamian Valley. But all of this, the thing to realize is that one of the things that the Bible does over and over and over again is it exposes the fraudulence of these idols and exposes them as demonic forces. And so when, for instance, we get to the story of the Israelites in captivity in Egypt, one of the things that is declared in the book of Exodus is God is going to bring judgment. Now, when we think about, say, the 10 plagues of Egypt, we tend to think that God is judging Pharaoh and God is judging the people of Egypt. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says, I will surely pass through the whole land of Egypt, says the Lord, and on every one of the gods of the Egyptians, I will execute righteous judgment, for I am the Lord God Almighty over the whole of the earth. So the purpose of the plagues was not to punish Pharaoh or to punish the Egyptians. It was to expose the gods of the Egyptians as fraudulent, as idols. And that's what each of the plagues actually did. So, for instance, if you go through the pantheon of the Egyptian gods, you start to realize that each one of the plagues was tailor-made to expose one of the gods.
Yep.
So the the goddess of the Nile wore a red cloak in all of the portrayals of the goddess, and this goddess Hapi was responsible for the fertility of the Nile. Well, to turn the Nile red through the striking of the staff of Moses was to expose the fraudulence and the impotence of this supposedly all-powerful goddess. Mm-hmm. And it goes all the way, down through. One of the gods is portrayed always as a human being with a frog's head. So the plague of frogs. Another was portrayed as a human being with a gnat's head. Another had a locust head. I mean, every single one of the plagues was aimed at one of the gods. In addition to that, the 10 Commandments, which were given later on Mount Sinai, all addressed the sins of those Egyptian gods. While the people were down in the valley at the foot of Mount Sinai and Moses was up top and they started longing after Egypt, God gave 10 commandments that were specifically aimed at the sin proclivities of each of the Egyptian gods. Again, exposing not only God's perfect moral order, but also the fraudulence of these idols.
When you were like, when you understand it in context, like out of context, it's wild. Reading the Old Testament, it's like, what is going on? This is the most
Right.
ludicrous faith. Why would I give my life to it in 2025? Valid statement. But then you put it in context like you just did, and that makes so much sense. It really is a proclamation of authority over something that they truly thought had power. And God said, no, I have authority over that.
Right, right. And once we start to understand how God's good providence is worked out in history, exposing the fraudulent and elevating that which is right and good and true and beautiful, we start to understand the flow of cultures and the character and nature of history. Now, when we look at events really close to our time, it's a lot harder because we're so close to it. It's very difficult for us to make those kinds of assessments. But when
as they were at the time.
Yeah. But when we look back at history, we can start to see the unfolding of God's providence and his purposefulness, even in the midst of man's rebellion, his treachery, his debauchery, his destructiveness to other human beings. Even there, we can start to see the unfolding of God's purposes.
Even because I feel like talking about more modern catastrophes, like those are the things that people really like hinge their atheism on, of like, how
Right.
could there be a God when the Holocaust happened? How could there be a God with this war happening? How could there be a God when innocent people died in 9/11? You know, those are the things that people hinge their disdain for it. But you're saying that God has a hand in that.
Well, yeah. I mean, part of it is just a misconception of who God is. Is God supposed to be our nanny who keeps us on a mall leash everywhere we go so that we don't wander into the wrong spot? Is God?
Oh my gosh.
Is God Santa Claus? He's only good to be jolly and nice and hand out gifts at various times, or
I
is
love it.
or is God a sovereign, just, and merciful God who is bringing redemption into the midst of a people, none of whom deserve his mercy or his kindness?
Yes. Yes.
And so when we look at the catastrophes of history, and there are horrific catastrophes, there's not a person alive on the planet who does not have moments where they look back and say, oh, where was God in this? And the answer is God is there bringing good out of bad. The bad is stuff we've done. God didn't make Hitler. God didn't make Stalin. God didn't make Mao. God didn't make Idi Amin. God didn't make COVID. Those are things that we foisted upon ourselves through a whole series of bad decisions and horrific selfishness and foolishness. But out of that, God brings redemptive purposes, raises up heroes who champion the cause of what is right and good and true. And so if we really want a God who's just basically a vending machine, where we can pick and choose what it is that we want, we put in our little faith quarter and we get our little treat, we've created one of the idols. That's exactly what the pantheon of gods was for the Greeks, the Romans. That's the story that Homer tells in the Iliad, that Homer tells in the Odyssey. That kind of promiscuous and improvident God is what the gods of the world always are. So when somebody says, where was God in 9/11? They're basically saying, why can't we have a Zeus? Why can't we have a Jupiter?
Wait, what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is a God who we can appease with our, our desires, our wants, or
A God we can
our
control.
sacrifices in order to do our bidding.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow, this is so beautiful. Because immediately before you kind of made your last point, I was thinking like, okay, but like God does have power. Like God does let bad things happen for his own purposes. I'm not saying that I'm not saying it's up to me to determine, oh, that was bad, he shouldn't have done that. That's not on me. Like I don't want that job to determine that kind of thing. God did that. But there are things that are tough still done by God. Like I think it'd be ignorant, and like correct me if I'm wrong here, to say like, well, God only does the good things, everything else is the enemy. Because I think
Correct.
that word good is sometimes the hard things need to happen. Sometimes the tough stuff needs to happen, and that's still God. But as Christians, it's like, oh, like if it's not good and holy, like it was the enemy, Holocaust,
right.
That was the enemy. But like me winning $1 million, that was God. It's like sometimes me losing that $1 million was God.
Absolutely. Because the $1 million was going to steer me in a direction that I shouldn't have gone.
Right.
There's a wonderful book by Arthur Pink. It's almost a century old now, called The Sovereignty of God. And in it, he says, he makes the argument from the scriptures that God is altogether sovereign, that nothing occurs anywhere at any time that is a violation of his providence. Now, that doesn't mean that he designed it, that he wanted it. It's that nothing has taken him by surprise, and nothing occurs outside of his purview. He says this. He says, what do we mean by the sovereignty of God? Well, what we mean is the supremacy of God, the kingship of God, the godhood of God. To say that God is sovereign is simply to declare that God is God. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the Most High, doing according to his will. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the Almighty, the possessor of all power in heaven and on earth. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the governor among the nations. To say that God is God, that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. This is the God of the Bible. So one of the things that we have to realize is God is working out his purposes in history. He did not send an airplane into the Twin Towers, but none of that took him by surprise, and he uses that for his purposes.
Yeah.
Let's take COVID, for example. None of us would have ever wished COVID on anyone or anything. Businesses were destroyed. Lives were lost. Political turmoil was the result. Fractiousness, the mask, anti-mask, the vax, anti-vax divides, split up families, split up communities, split up churches. At the same time, one of the things that COVID did was it destroyed the old normal.
Mm-hmm.
And the old normal needed to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
The old normal needed to go away. A lot of churches just collapsed during the time of COVID. Why did they collapse? Because during COVID and in the days afterwards, after the habits had been broken, people started to realize, there's nothing going on there. There's no reason for me to go back. Yeah. Meanwhile, other churches exploded with growth. Our church doubled in size during COVID because there was something going on. It was substantive. We weren't cowering in fear. We recognized that there were dangers and we needed to care for each other well, but So what happened was God didn't foist COVID upon us as an affliction or as punishment, but in the midst of this awful circumstance, God brought forth good results.
Yeah. So how do you recommend people to look at events like 9/11, like the Holocaust, like COVID, and see God in it versus make it put a stake in the sand for why they wouldn't believe in God? Like, what is the proper Christian lens that we as Christians should be, upholding and encouraging in others when it comes to like, no, the good stuff was God and the bad stuff was Satan. Like, how do we do that without sounding like idiots?
Well, first, one of the things about 9/11 is that 9/11 portrayed for us the worst that man could ever do and the best that man could ever be.
What?
The thought of firemen rushing into the Twin Towers, rushing up the stairs, saving as many people as possible, their own lives in danger, is one of the most heroic and selfless examples in all of human history that I can think of. If you've ever had the opportunity to visit the 9/11 Memorial in New York City and see some of the film footage and see some of the wreckage, I've written a book about the struggles of the Middle East, and the opening chapter is I interviewed a number of people who were there in New York City, many of whom who were in the Twin Towers when the planes struck the buildings, and the stories of people rushing up the stairs, grabbing people who were in wheelchairs and couldn't make it down the stairs and carrying them down, 70 flights of stairs to safety. The stories of heroism are remarkable. I can remember so clearly this sense of astonishment. George W. Bush, who could not read a teleprompter without stumbling all over himself, stood in the rubble of 9/11 and became one of the most eloquent, passionate, and clear communicators I've ever seen. It was like the man was transformed before our eyes. There's something about adversity that brings out the best in human beings. So when we look at the totality of events, I mean, the recent floods in Texas, the number of heroes, the people who went, for days and days, attempting to save lives, to find loved ones. It's remarkable. I was in California speaking when the wildfires broke out in LA, and I wound up being stuck in Burbank for almost 3 days because flights couldn't get out. And I was astonished that there were a number of firefighters who were staying in the same hotel in Burbank that I was because they couldn't get home. And I talked to this one guy in the cafe. He had been on the front lines of the fire for 36 hours straight. For most of that time, no additional food, no water. They were just out there doing whatever they could to save whoever they could and whatever they could. And I just thought, this is a horrific tragedy, but I am watching the most beautiful good come out of human beings that I can imagine.
Yeah.
So when we look at tragedy, we have to look at the whole picture and not have a narrow, siloed focus on the calamity of it all.
That's a great answer. Thank you for explaining that. With regards to multiple gods, this is something we touched on at the beginning, but I think even amidst these tragedies that are modern, you said it yourself that like these gods just take different shape. Like what happened at the very beginning still existed, and then they kind of just like become more distorted and more elaborate. What are some of the gods in your opinion that still exist today that maybe we don't acknowledge? Because to me, it's just part of culture. What, fame? That's just a goal, and money, that's what we need. And, those are just kind of the top of mind ones. But what are the ones that are more subtle, that they slip under the radar? And we're actually a very paganistic society, and we might even be pagans ourselves if we're not too careful. What are the ones that we need to be aware of?
Well, obviously, in modern America, we worship fame, money, influence, human sexuality, all of these things. And there are embodied versions of the ancient gods that show up in modern pop culture, in our music, in our films. These become the things that we set our affections on. Our ultimate concern. The theologian Paul Tillich used to say that we know what we worship by what our ultimate concerns are. Every society has blasphemy laws. You can tell what the gods of a society are by what you are not allowed to say. So we have a panoply of gods that are guarded by these blasphemy laws, and you can. Dave Ramsey, the financial advisor, will often say things like, "The most profound theological statement that any human being can make can be found in their checkbook." What do you spend all of your treasure on? What is it that you have set before you as your ultimate concern? There's your God.
Well, oh my gosh. I'm like thinking about what mine is.
Yeah, I mean, all of us. That's a real gut check, isn't it? Because what do we spend our time on? What do we spend when we're daydreaming, when we're, wishing and dreaming? What is it that we have set our affections on?
It's hard to kind of characterize it in the same place, though, that I would characterize Zeus, because I'm not like, I would say the answer to that would be myself. I think I spend money on myself. I think I spend money on my achievements and how I want to be perceived. And I care so much about that. But I wouldn't say that I like sacrifice myself the way that I saw people sacrificing to gods in the past.
Well, one of the things about the mythological systems that existed for the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, they were as secular as we are in terms of their everyday lives. They weren't thinking about Zeus or Jupiter day after day. It was in a time of crisis when the crops were failing, or when the weather turned terrible, or when their ship was being wrecked on the shoals of the coastline of Greece. Those were the moments that they suddenly cried out. And we see that, for instance, just read the narrative of Homer in the Iliad. The gods are ever present, but they're pretty separate from the lives of Achilles and Atlas and Hector. They're just in the backdrop, and they intervene at critical moments. Well, it's the same thing with us. You're right. The primary idols of modern American society are self. But we've elevated ourselves like Marvel superheroes or Greek gods on Olympus, and we weave the same sort of storyline around ourselves. So the gods are Idolatry is ever present.
Oh. Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Grant. I did not expect this conversation to go this way, but you have carried this conversation on your back. So I am so glad that you're here. Okay. Final question. What does history look like if you're going to place God at the center of it?
What does history look like?
Yeah, how can we refresh this? I do a lot of therapy, or I used to, and EMDR was a huge part of that. And a huge part of EMDR is looking at my trauma and rewriting it. So now, me getting abandoned on the playground at 5 years old, used to say that was traumatic. Now I look back and I say that poor girl didn't deserve that. Shout out to therapy. How can we do that EMDR with Christ, looking back at history? Oh my gosh, God let babies die. Oh my gosh, God annihilated this entire species, this entire race of people. How do we look back at that and see, look what God did? God, yes, that was a bad thing, but God did this.
Yeah, I think we have to reset ourselves to look at the larger picture rather than zeroing in on the particulars. We look at the larger universals and see where those awful moments, those calamities, those traumas, where those things led. I have a dear friend who had childhood cancer. He was deeply traumatized. He's now in his 60s. He's 50 years ago, cancer treatments were brutal. I mean, they're still brutal, but they were horrific. It was like medieval torture. And he endured it, and he was able to survive. And he's been cancer-free now for 50 years.
Wow.
What it did for him, though, was he became fascinated by the medical world. He's a doctor today. He would not have been a doctor if he had not gone through that early childhood trauma. So what happened was God redeemed that powerfully in him. He now looks back and he says, I am so glad that I did not waste my cancer. That's a really powerful, redemptive way of looking at things. What we have to do is we have to look at all of life like that. I look back at the really difficult things that I went through, the peculiar things of my childhood story, and there are all kinds of things that I could point to that reshaped who I am and made me what I am today. So I look back and I think to myself, I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but I wouldn't take any of it away.
Wow. Dr. Grant, thank you so much for your time today. This was an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful for the time you've given us and the intellect. I mean, this wasn't an easy conversation, but you made it seem easy. So thank you.
God bless you. Thank you. This is a joy.
This is such a joy. You're always welcome back, and we'll find a reason to bring you back soon.
Great.